You just removed a man this country once trusted with war, and you didn't even know it. The words hadn't been spoken yet, but somehow they were already hanging in the air, waiting for the moment everything would fall apart. Just minutes earlier, the restaurant had been wrapped in a warm, golden glow, the kind of place where polished glasses clink softly and quiet conversations blend into the hum of expensive comfort, where tailored suits and evening dresses moved like a carefully choreographed scene. And then there was Marcus Hale. He sat alone near the window, his posture straight but relaxed, a man who carried silence like it meant something. His dark jacket was simple, clean, nothing flashy, but it fit him the way discipline fits a life shaped by something deeper than appearances. In front of him, a half-finished plate, untouched for several minutes now. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because he had already noticed it. The looks, subtle at first, a glance held just a second too long, a whisper that stopped when he turned his head, the kind of tension you couldn't point to, but you could feel pressing against your skin. Imagine sitting there, doing nothing wrong, yet somehow becoming the center of a room that refuses to say it out loud. Across the room, manager Ethan Cole stood near the bar, arms folded, eyes fixed, watching, calculating. There had been a complaint, or at least that's what he told himself. A customer uncomfortable, a presence that didn't fit the atmosphere. He adjusted his tie, exhaled slowly, and made a decision that felt routine to him, but would change everything. He walked over, each step measured, each second stretching the silence tighter. "Sir," he said, voice low but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Marcus didn't respond right away. He simply looked up, his eyes steady, unreadable, like he had heard this before in different rooms, different cities, different forms. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. No anger, no raised voice, just a question. But Ethan didn't answer it. "Not really. We've had some concerns," he replied, vague, rehearsed, safe behind words that didn't need to explain themselves. Around them, the room shifted. People stopped mid-conversation. A fork paused halfway to a mouth. Phones subtly tilted, cameras ready without being obvious. Marcus glanced around once, taking it all in, the discomfort, the curiosity, the quiet judgment, and then back at the manager. He could have argued. He could have stood his ground. But instead, he exhaled slowly, almost like he was measuring something no one else could see. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even defiance. It was something else, something heavier. But Ethan didn't hear it that way. Or maybe he didn't want to. Because a minute later, the doors opened, and two officers stepped inside, their presence cutting through the room like a shift in temperature. Officer Daniel Brooks led the way, his eyes scanning until they landed on Marcus. No questions, no hesitation, just movement. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." The words were firm, practiced, final. And just like that, the room leaned in, watching, waiting, recording. Marcus slowly pushed his chair back, the faint scrape against the floor echoing louder than it should have. He stood up, tall, composed, his face calm in a way that didn't match the situation unfolding around him. For a brief second, his hand brushed against his jacket, where something small and metallic caught the light before disappearing again. No one noticed. Not yet. The officer stepped closer. The manager watched. The crowd held its breath. And Marcus didn't resist. He just looked at them, one by one, as if memorizing every face in the room, before taking a single step forward into a moment that none of them were ready to understand. The night air outside felt colder than it should have, like the warmth of the restaurant had never really been meant for him in the first place. And as the glass doors closed behind Marcus Hale, the soft hum of conversation inside was replaced by the distant sounds of traffic and the quiet tension of a crowd that had followed just far enough to keep watching without getting involved. Phones still raised, whispers still moving, eyes still locked on him as if the story had only just begun, and in a way, it had. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped slightly ahead, guiding the direction without ever needing to touch him, his posture rigid, his expression carrying that familiar certainty that came from believing he was in control, while the second officer lingered just behind, silent but present, forming a corridor of authority that Marcus walked through without resistance, his pace steady, his breathing even, his gaze forward, as if this moment was not new to him, as if he had already lived versions of it before in places far more unforgiving than a city sidewalk. You can explain everything down at the station, Brooks said, his tone flat, rehearsed, the kind of sentence that did not invite conversation but ended it. And Marcus gave a small nod, not in agreement, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, like he understood something the officer did not, something deeper than the situation unfolding on the surface. Imagine standing there, surrounded by strangers who have already decided who you are, before you have said a single word, before they have asked a single question, and realizing that nothing you say in that moment will change what they believe they see. A car passed by slowly, headlights cutting across Marcus's face for a brief second, illuminating the calm in his expression, the absence of panic, the lack of urgency. And it was that stillness that made one of the onlookers hesitate, just for a moment, as if something did not add up, but the moment passed quickly, swallowed by the louder narrative forming in the crowd. Behind them, through the glass, manager Ethan Cole stood watching, arms still folded, his jaw tight. But there was something different now, something subtle, a flicker of uncertainty that he could not quite name, because Marcus had not argued, had not resisted, had not given him the reaction he expected, and without that reaction, the situation felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its ending. Marcus reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and both officers stiffened, their attention sharpening instantly. But he did not pull out anything threatening, only a phone, worn but well kept, and he paused for a second before unlocking it, his thumb hovering over the screen as if considering his next move with the same measured calm he had carried since the beginning. "Go ahead," Brooks said, watching closely. "Make it quick." Marcus nodded once, then typed a single message, short, precise, and sent it without hesitation, the screen going dark again as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. And for a moment, nothing happened. The street remained the same, the air unchanged, the crowd still murmuring. But something had shifted, quietly, invisibly, like the first crack in something that had seemed solid just seconds before. Marcus lifted his eyes again, not to the officers this time, but past them, beyond them, towards something none of them could see yet, and his voice, when he spoke, was low, steady, and almost reflective. This is the part where most people start to realize they made a mistake. Brooks frowned slightly, the confidence in his posture tightening just a bit, not gone, but no longer effortless, and somewhere in the distance, faint but growing, the sound of an approaching engine began to rise, unnoticed by most, but not by Marcus, who simply stood there, waiting, as if time itself had just shifted onto his side. The sound grew louder now, no longer something distant or easy to ignore, but a low, steady rumble that seemed to push through the night air with purpose. And while most of the crowd remained focused on Marcus and the officers, a few heads began to turn, curiosity pulling their attention toward the street where a pair of headlights approached, brighter than the others, slower, deliberate, as if whoever was behind the wheel was not in a hurry, but also not to be delayed. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his stance slightly, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the source of the sound, then back at Marcus, trying to hold on to the authority that had felt so certain just moments ago. "You called someone," he said, not as a question, but as a statement meant to reassert control. Marcus did not answer immediately. He simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides, the same calm presence that had unsettled the room inside now settling over the sidewalk like a quiet pressure. "I informed someone," he replied finally, his voice even, measured, carrying no urgency and no apology. The difference between those two words hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. Imagine realizing that the person you thought needed help had just sent for something else entirely. The vehicle came into full view now, dark, unmarked, but unmistakably official in the way it moved, in the way it stopped, in the way the engine idled for a brief second before the door opened. The street seemed to hold its breath. From the driver's side, a man stepped out, tall, composed, his presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere without a single word being spoken. He wore a pressed uniform beneath a long coat, the insignia on his chest catching the light just enough to draw attention without needing to demand it. Colonel James Whitaker did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked forward, each step controlled, each movement precise, until he stood a few feet away from the officers, his gaze moving from them to Marcus and back again, taking in the entire scene in a matter of seconds. The crowd quieted, not because they were told to, but because something about the moment made noise feel inappropriate. Brooks straightened instinctively, the edge in his posture tightening as recognition flickered across his face. Not full understanding yet, but enough to disrupt his certainty. "Sir," he began, his tone shifting, searching for footing. "This situation is under control." The colonel did not respond right away. His eyes settled on Marcus for a brief moment, and in that glance there was something unspoken, a recognition that ran deeper than rank or title, something earned rather than given. Marcus gave the smallest nod in return, almost imperceptible, but enough. Then Whitaker turned his attention fully to the officers. "Is it?" he asked quietly. No accusation, no raised voice, just a question that carried more weight than anything said so far. Brooks hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough for the balance to shift. Enough for the room that no longer existed around them to feel like it had turned inside out. Behind the glass doors, Ethan Cole stepped closer, his earlier confidence now replaced with something tighter, something uncertain, as he watched the exchange unfold in a way he could not control. The colonel took one more step forward, closing the distance, his voice still calm, still controlled, but now unmistakably firm. "Do you know who you asked to leave that restaurant tonight?" The question landed heavier than anything before it, not because of how it was said, but because of what it implied, and for the first time since this began, no one had an immediate answer. Not the officers, not the manager, not the crowd. Only Marcus stood unchanged, his expression steady, as if the moment everyone else was trying to understand had already passed for him long ago. The silence that followed the colonel's question did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like something pressing down on every person standing there, forcing them to confront a reality that had not yet been spoken out loud. And Officer Daniel Brooks felt it first, not in words, but in the subtle tightening of his chest, in the way his posture no longer felt as solid as it had just moments ago, in the way his eyes shifted briefly toward Marcus and then back to the man standing in front of him, trying to connect pieces that no longer fit together the way he expected. "Sir," Brooks began again, but this time his voice lacked the certainty it carried before. "We received a complaint. We followed procedure." The explanation sounded smaller now, thinner, like it was being weighed against something much larger. Colonel James Whitaker did not interrupt, did not raise his voice, did not react the way most people might have in a moment like this. Instead, he let the words settle, let them exist in the space between them, before taking a slow breath and stepping slightly to the side, his gaze never leaving the officer. "Procedure," he repeated quietly, not as agreement, but as examination, as if the word itself deserved to be questioned. Imagine building your confidence on rules you believe are solid, only to realize those rules were never enough to understand the person standing in front of you. Behind the officers, the glass doors opened again, and manager Ethan Cole stepped outside, drawn by the tension he could no longer ignore, his earlier authority now replaced by something far less comfortable, something uncertain, as he approached slowly, stopping just short of the group, his eyes moving quickly between Marcus, the officers, and the colonel, searching for clarity but finding none. The colonel finally turned his attention toward him, and that single shift in focus was enough to make Ethan straighten instinctively, as if he had just been called into a room he was not prepared to enter. "You made the call," Whitaker said, his tone calm, direct, leaving no room to deflect. Ethan swallowed, nodding once. "We had concerns," he replied, repeating the same words he had used earlier, but now they sounded different, less confident, less certain, as if even he could hear the weakness in them. The colonel studied him for a moment, not with anger, but with something more precise, something that cut deeper than raised voices ever could. "Concerns about what?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried a weight that made the air feel tighter. Ethan hesitated, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, because the answer he had relied on before no longer felt complete, no longer felt safe to say out loud. And that hesitation said more than any explanation could. Marcus stood a few feet away, watching, silent, composed, his presence unchanged, as if he had stepped outside of the tension entirely. as if this moment was no longer about him, but about everyone else realizing what they had done. The colonel turned back toward the officers, his expression steady, his voice still controlled, but now carrying a quiet authority that could not be ignored. You removed him without asking who he was, without verifying anything beyond a complaint, he said, not accusing, simply stating what had already happened, and in that statement was the beginning of something irreversible. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, the ground beneath him no longer as firm as before. We acted based on the information we had, he replied, but even as he said it, the words felt incomplete. The colonel nodded once, acknowledging the response, then let a brief silence settle again before speaking, his next words slower, deliberate, each one landing with precision. That is exactly the problem. The sentence did not need to be louder to be heard. It did not need emphasis to carry impact. Because in that moment, it was not just a response. It was a turning point, the line where assumption ended and consequence began. And for the first time since this started, the authority in the scene had shifted completely, even if no one had fully admitted it yet. The words lingered in the air long after the colonel spoke them, not loud, not aggressive, but impossible to ignore, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire scene had been paused by something deeper than authority, something closer to truth pressing its way to the surface. And Marcus Hale stood at the center of it all, still calm, still composed, his presence unchanged while everything around him began to shift. Officer Daniel Brooks glanced again at Marcus, this time not with assumption, but with uncertainty, the kind that creeps in when a situation no longer follows the script you believed in. And for the first time, he really looked at him, not just at his clothes or where he had been sitting, but at the details that had been there all along, unnoticed, like the way he stood, balanced, grounded, like someone trained to remain steady when everything else moved, or the faint glimpse of that small, metallic emblem earlier, now hidden again but no longer forgotten. Imagine realizing that the person you judged in seconds has a history you never took the time to see. Colonel Whitaker shifted his stance slightly, his gaze steady, his voice controlled, but carrying a weight that no one could mistake. Marcus Hale, he said, not as an introduction, but as recognition, and the name itself seemed to land differently, like it belonged to something larger than the moment they were standing in. Marcus gave a small nod, acknowledging him, and that simple exchange carried more meaning than anything spoken so far. The colonel turned back to the officers, his expression firm now, no longer just observing, but clarifying. Decorated combat. Marine, he continued, each word deliberate, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Multiple deployments, commendations for leadership under pressure, a man who has represented this country in places most people will never see. The street fell completely silent. Even the faint sounds of traffic seemed distant now, as if the world itself had stepped back to let the truth settle. Brooks felt the shift immediately, not just in the atmosphere, but inside himself, the realization forming piece by piece, heavier with each passing second. The man standing in front of him was no longer just someone from a complaint, no longer just a situation to manage, but someone whose identity carried weight, history, and meaning far beyond what he had assumed. Behind them, Ethan Cole's face lost what little confidence remained, his eyes widening slightly as the words sank in, replaying the last few minutes in his mind, the decision, the approach, the certainty he had felt, now unraveling with each detail he had never bothered to ask. Marcus remained silent through it all. He did not step forward, did not correct anyone, did not demand anything. He simply stood there, allowing the truth to exist on its own, because he did not need to prove it. It had already been proven long before this moment. The colonel took one final step forward, his presence now fully defining the space, his voice lower, but sharper, carrying the kind of authority that does not need to be repeated. And you removed him, he said, not raising his tone, not adding emphasis, because he did not need to, based on a complaint you did not verify. The statement settled heavily, not as an accusation, but as a fact, and facts, unlike assumptions, do not bend once they are spoken clearly. Brooks opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, but no words came, because there was nothing left to justify, nothing left to explain that could stand against what had just been revealed. The balance had shifted completely now, not with force, not with confrontation, but with something far more powerful, the quiet arrival of truth. And for the first time since this began, the question was no longer whether Marcus belonged there, but whether anyone else had understood what belonging really meant. No one spoke for several seconds, and in that silence, something irreversible settled over the scene, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that could not be undone, as if every assumption that had been made just minutes earlier was now being quietly dismantled piece by piece. And Marcus Hale remained exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, the same man they had asked to leave, but no longer seen the same way. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his stance again, this time not out of authority, but discomfort, the kind that comes when the ground beneath your certainty starts to give way. And he glanced briefly at his partner, searching for something familiar, some shared confidence to hold on to, but found none, because the moment had moved beyond them. "We did not know," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge, and the words hung there, not as a defense, but as an admission. Imagine realizing that not knowing is exactly what created the problem in the first place. Colonel James Whitaker held his gaze for a moment, not with anger, but with a calm that made the weight of the situation even clearer. "That is precisely why you ask before you act," he replied, his tone even, controlled, but carrying a firmness that did not need to rise to be felt. Behind them, the faint glow of phone screens continued to capture everything. But now the angle had changed, the focus no longer on Marcus as a spectacle, but on the officers, on the manager, on the shift unfolding in real time, and whispers moved differently through the small crowd, quieter, more uncertain, as if the narrative they had formed was no longer stable. Ethan Cole took a small step forward, then stopped, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by something far less comfortable, something closer to regret, and he cleared his throat slightly, as if trying to find words that no longer came easily. "Sir," he said, addressing the colonel but unable to keep his eyes from drifting toward Marcus. "There must have been a misunderstanding." The word felt weak the moment it left his mouth. Marcus looked at him then, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that made the moment heavier, because there was no reaction to push against, no resistance to justify what had happened. "Was there?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice steady, not challenging, but reflective, and the question landed in a way that forced Ethan to confront it rather than explain it away. The colonel did not interrupt this time. He allowed the exchange to exist, to unfold, because sometimes the truth carries more weight when it is not guided. Ethan hesitated, his mouth opening slightly before closing again, because the answer he wanted to give no longer fit the reality in front of him. The officers remained still, their earlier presence now diminished, not by force, but by understanding, and Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show that the moment had shifted beyond control and into consequence. The street felt different now, the same space, the same people, but altered, as if everyone standing there had been forced to see something they had overlooked before. Marcus reached into his pocket once more, slowly, deliberately, pulling out the same phone, glancing at the screen for a brief second, then lowering it again, as if confirming something had already been set in motion. No urgency, no rush, just quiet certainty. And in that stillness, it became clear that what was happening was no longer about a single moment outside a restaurant, but about something larger, something that would not end when the crowd dispersed or when the night moved on, because some moments do not fade. They follow, they echo, and they wait for the people involved to decide what they will do with the truth they have just been forced to face. The moment stretched, quiet but no longer uncertain, and what had once felt like a simple situation now carried the weight of something far greater, something that would not disappear just because the night moved on, and Marcus Hale stood there as if he had already accepted that truth long before anyone else had even begun to understand it. The faint hum of the idling vehicle behind Colonel Whitaker blended with the distant city noise, but no one in that small circle seemed to hear it anymore, because their attention had narrowed completely to what was unfolding in front of them, to the shift they could feel but could not undo. Officer Daniel Brooks lowered his gaze for a brief second, not in defeat, but in reflection, the kind that comes when a person begins to replay their actions in real time, searching for the moment where things could have gone differently. And when he looked back up, there was something altered in his expression, something quieter, less certain, but more aware. "Sir," he said, this time addressing Marcus directly, his voice steady but no longer rigid. "We should have asked more questions." The words were simple, but they carried something that had been missing before, an acknowledgement that did not try to defend itself. Marcus studied him for a moment, not with judgment, not with approval, but with the same calm presence that had defined him from the beginning. And in that silence, the weight of the apology was left to stand on its own. Imagine being in a moment where the person who misjudged you finally sees you clearly, and realizing that clarity does not erase what happened, but it changes what comes next. Manager Ethan Cole shifted uncomfortably, his hands no longer steady, his earlier certainty now replaced by something that looked closer to accountability, and he took a step forward, hesitating only briefly before speaking. "Mr. Hale," he said, his voice careful, measured, "you are welcome to come back inside. Dinner is on the house. We can make this right." The offer hung in the air, but it did not land the way he intended, because some things cannot be balanced by a gesture, no matter how well it is presented. Marcus let the words settle for a second before responding, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a clarity that cut through the moment. "It was never about the meal," he said quietly. The simplicity of the sentence made it heavier, because it forced everyone listening to understand what had actually been at stake. Colonel Whitaker watched the exchange without interruption, his presence still firm, but now less about asserting authority and more about ensuring that the truth was not softened or overlooked. Around them, the crowd had grown quieter, the earlier whispers replaced by a kind of still attention, as if everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that would stay with them longer than they expected. Marcus glanced briefly at the restaurant, at the warm light still glowing through the windows, at the people inside who had returned to their conversations, but not quite to the same comfort. And then he looked back at the group in front of him. "You already made a decision," he continued, his tone even, not harsh, not emotional, just clear, and decisions like that do not disappear because the situation changed. Ethan lowered his eyes slightly, the truth of that statement settling in without resistance, because there was nothing left to argue against. The officers remained still, no longer guiding, no longer directing, just present in a moment that had moved beyond them, and for the first time, the space felt balanced, not controlled by one side or the other, but grounded in something more honest. Marcus took a slow breath, then a single step back, not retreating, but repositioning himself as someone who no longer needed to prove anything, because the truth had already done that for him. And in that quiet shift, it became clear that what mattered now was not what had happened, but what each person would carry forward from it, because some lessons do not come from being told, they come from being lived, and once they arrive, they do not leave quietly. The air no longer carried tension the same way it had before, but it was not light either. It was something in between, something reflective, as if every person standing there was now aware that they had crossed a line they could not step back over. And Marcus Hale stood at the center of that realization without claiming it, without pressing it, simply allowing it to exist in its full weight. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching behind each person like quiet reminders of the moments that had just unfolded, and for the first time, no one seemed eager to leave, not because they wanted to stay, but because walking away now felt like avoiding something that demanded to be understood. Colonel James Whitaker glanced briefly toward the small cluster of onlookers, their phones still raised, their expressions no longer curious but contemplative, and then back to Marcus, his voice lowering slightly, not for secrecy, but for clarity. "This does not end here," he said, not as a warning, but as a simple acknowledgement of what had already been set into motion. Marcus nodded once, his expression unchanged, because he understood that better than anyone. Imagine knowing that the moment people think is over is actually just the beginning of what follows. Officer Daniel Brooks shifted again, but this time it was not discomfort, it was something closer to acceptance, and he reached toward his radio, pausing for just a second before speaking quietly into it. His tone controlled, but different now, reporting what had happened not as a routine call, but as something that required attention, something that could not be summarized in a few simple words. The response crackled faintly through the speaker, distant, procedural, but even that sounded different now, because the situation it referred to had already outgrown the language used to describe it. Manager Ethan Cole took a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly as if the weight of the moment had finally settled fully on him. And he looked once more at Marcus, this time without assumption, without authority, just with the recognition of someone who understood that a mistake had been made in a way that could not be undone by a polite offer or a quick apology. Inside the restaurant, movement resumed, but it was quieter now, more cautious, as if the atmosphere had shifted in ways the walls themselves could feel, and a few people near the windows continued to watch, not out of curiosity, but because they knew they had witnessed something that would stay with them long after the night ended. Marcus turned his gaze briefly toward the street, where cars passed steadily, headlights cutting through the dark, life continuing in its usual rhythm, unaffected on the surface, but he knew that not all moments were meant to be visible to everyone. Some were meant to be carried by those who experienced them, shaping what came next in ways that could not always be seen immediately. He reached into his pocket once more, his hand brushing lightly against that small metallic piece, the symbol of a life lived in service, not for recognition, but for purpose, and then he let his hand fall back to his side, because he did not need to show it, not anymore. Colonel Whitaker stepped back slightly, giving space, not as a withdrawal, but as a signal that what needed to be said had already been said, and that the next steps would not be decided in this moment alone. The officers remained where they were, no longer directing, no longer leading, just present. Their role changed not by force, but by understanding, and Brooks lowered his radio slowly, his eyes moving once more to Marcus, as if committing this moment to memory. The night continued. The city moved, but something had shifted permanently, not in the lights or the sounds, but in the people standing there, because once you see clearly, you cannot return to the comfort of not seeing. And as Marcus finally took a step forward, not toward the restaurant, not toward the officers, but simply forward, it was clear that he was not leaving anything behind. He was carrying it with him, not as a burden, but as a truth that would continue to speak long after the voices around him had gone quiet. The city did not pause for what had just happened. Traffic continued. Conversations resumed. Lights flickered across windows as if nothing had changed. But for those who stood there, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and Marcus Hale walked forward with the same steady pace he had carried from the beginning, not hurried, not delayed, just certain, as if he had already accepted the weight of moments like this long before they arrived. Behind him, the small group remained still for a few seconds longer, as if watching him leave was part of understanding what they had just witnessed, and Officer Daniel Brooks lowered his head slightly, not out of shame alone, but out of recognition, the kind that settles slowly and stays long after the moment passes. Imagine realizing that the person you questioned never needed to prove anything to you, and that the proof was never the point. Manager Ethan Cole remained near the entrance, his hands now still, his posture no longer guarded, as he watched Marcus move further down the sidewalk, each step creating distance not just physically, but symbolically, a separation between who Marcus was and what they had assumed him to be, and that distance could not be closed by an apology or an offer, no matter how sincere it might become later. Colonel James Whitaker stood quietly beside the officers, his presence no longer commanding the moment, but anchoring it, ensuring that what had been revealed would not be dismissed once the scene dissolved into memory. "This is where it matters," he said calmly, his voice directed not at Marcus, but at those who remained. "What you do after you realize you were wrong." The words were not sharp, not forceful, but they carried a clarity that settled deeper than anything else said that night. Brooks nodded once, slowly, as if committing that sentence to something beyond memory, something closer to responsibility, and he glanced once more in the direction Marcus had gone, not expecting a response, not asking for one, just acknowledging what had passed between them without words. The colonel turned slightly, his gaze moving across the quiet crowd, the phones that had captured everything, the faces that would carry this story beyond the sidewalk, beyond the night, and into spaces where it might matter in ways none of them could predict. Inside the restaurant, the lights remained warm, the tables still set, but something in the atmosphere had changed, something subtle but permanent, like a room that had been forced to confront itself and could not return to what it was before. Marcus continued walking, the sound of his footsteps steady against the pavement, his silhouette gradually blending into the rhythm of the city. And yet there was nothing ordinary about the way he carried himself, because he was not walking away from the moment. He was moving through it, carrying it with the same quiet strength that had defined him from the start. He did not look back, not because it did not matter, but because he already understood what had been revealed, and he did not need to see it again to know it was real. The night moved forward, as it always does, but the truth lingered, not loud, not dramatic, just present, in the minds of those who had witnessed it, in the silence that followed them home, in the questions they would ask themselves later when the noise had faded. And somewhere between the streetlights and the shadows, between what was seen and what was understood, one thing remained clear, not spoken, but undeniable: that power is not proven in how loudly it demands respect, but in how quietly it stands when respect is denied. And that night, without raising his voice, without forcing a moment, Marcus Hale had shown them exactly what that meant.